People believe the kingdom fell because of war. But the truth is, it began to crumble the moment a vow was betrayed. In the annals of the kingdom of Illyrius, much is written the battles won at the borders and the gold that flowed through the merchant gates. The historians speak of King Alaric as a man of iron and granite, a ruler who solidified the disparate territories into a singular, formidable empire. Yet, the history books often overlook the shadow that walked beside him, the woman who provided the very foundation upon which his throne was built. This was the queen consort, Helena of the Northern Reach. To understand the tragedy that would eventually consume the halls of the Great Keep, one must first understand the nature of the bond that held them together for nearly 30 years. It was never a story of passion. In the circles of the highborn, especially in those decades following the Great Unification, love was considered a volatile and secondary thing, a luxury for those who did not have the weight of a 1,000-year lineage resting upon their shoulders. Their union was a masterpiece of diplomacy, a merging of Helena's ancestral lands and Alaric's military might. When they stood together on the high balcony on the day of their coronation, they did not look at each other with the soft eyes of youth. They looked out at the horizon, seeing the same map, the same responsibilities, and the same cold necessity of order. Helena was a woman of profound, quiet competence. She did not seek the spotlight of the court, nor did she care for performative graces of the younger nobility. Her power resided in the ledgers, the grain stores, the diplomatic correspondence, and the silent management of the king's household. She was the architect of the kingdom's internal peace. While Alaric rode to the frontiers to settle disputes with steel, Helena remained in the capital, ensuring the gears of the state turned without friction. They were two halves of a singular machine, bound by a contract of mutual respect and a shared understanding of what it meant to rule. The king respected her, or so it seemed for a quarter of a century. He relied on her counsel during the lean winters and trusted her judgment when the provincial lords grew restless. In their private chambers, conversation was rarely about personal feelings. They spoke of succession, the strength of the currency, and the alliances needed to keep the surrounding empires at bay. There was a certain dignity in this coldness. It was a life built on honor, a word that Helena held more sacred than any religious text. To her, honor was the invisible thread that kept the world from descending into chaos. If a king and queen could not hold to their word, then the law was nothing more than ink on parchment. As the years passed, the silver began to touch their hair, and the lines of age carved deep paths into Alaric's face. He became a symbol of enduring strength, a monarch who had outlasted his rivals and brought a golden age to Valerius. Helena, too, became a fixture of the state, as reliable and unchanging as the stone walls of the palace itself. She accepted the loneliness that came with her position. She understood that a queen consort is, by definition, a woman who has sacrificed her personal identity to become a pillar of the crown. She did not complain of the silence in their shared meals or the lack of warmth in their interactions. She believed that they were building something that would outlast their lives, a legacy of stability and prestige. However, power has a way of eroding the soul of a man who has had too much of it for too long. Alaric, in his 50s, began to view his achievements not as a collective effort of the crown, but as his own divine right. He grew comfortable in the peace Helena had curated for him. The danger of a long peace is that it breeds a certain kind of restlessness in men who are forged in conflict. He began to look at the walls of the palace not as a sanctuary, but as a cage. And he began to look at Helena not as the partner who had secured his reign, but as a reminder of his own aging and the heavy, dusty traditions he felt he had already satisfied. The original order of their lives was a delicate balance of duty and distance. It worked because the rules were clear. The king was the sword, and the queen was the shield. As long as the shield remained strong, the sword could strike where it pleased. But Helena, in her wisdom, knew that even the strongest shield can be cracked by a blow from within. She had lived her life by the code of the Northern Reach, where a promise was a blood oath and betrayal was the only sin that could not be washed away by time or gold. She believed that Alaric, despite his flaws, shared this fundamental morality. She believed that their shared history, their 30 years of labor and the honor of the throne they occupied together, were enough to keep the foundations of Illyria secure. She was mistaken. The first cracks did not appear in the walls of the city or in the loyalty of the army. They appeared in the small, unnoticed corners of the king's behavior. The shift was subtle, a low tide that receded so slowly that one might not notice the shore was growing wider until water was gone. The queen consort, ever the observer, began to sense a change in the atmosphere of the court, a slight tilting of the axis upon which her world turned. She did not know then that the man she had served for 3 decades was about to dismantle the very honor that gave his life meaning. She only knew that the silence in the palace had begun to feel different, no longer the silence of peace, but the silence of something being hidden. In the quiet corridors of power, betrayal rarely arrives with the sound of trumpets. It does not announce itself with a grand gesture or a public defiance of the law. Instead, it enters like a draft through a closing door, a slight chill that one notices only after the room has already grown cold. For Queen Elena, the realization did not come as a sudden shock, but as a series of small, discordant notes in a symphony she conducted for 30 years. To a woman whose life was built on the meticulous management of detail, these deviations were as glaring as a bloodstain on white silk. Though to the rest of court, everything appeared exactly as it should. The first sign was the king's time. Alaric had always been a man of rigid schedules, a soldier king who found comfort in predictable rhythm of the state. He rose at the same hour, reviewed the garrison reports at noon, and met with Elena in the late afternoon to discuss the domestic administration. But as the autumn of his life deepened, the rhythm began to falter. Council meetings that once took an hour began to stretch into 4. Reports of his whereabouts became vague, filtered through younger aides who looked at the floor when the queen inquired about the king's delays. It was a subtle redistribution of his presence, a withdrawal from the shared spaces it inhabited for decades. Then there was the matter of his vanity. A man who has spent his life in armor rarely concerns himself with the nuances of court fashion, yet Alaric began to take a sudden, almost youthful interest in his appearance. New tunics were ordered from the southern weavers, fabrics that were lighter and more decorative than the heavy wools of the north. He began to use oils scented with sandalwood and citrus, fragrances that lingered in the hallways long after he had passed. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like a monarch finally enjoying the fruits of his labor, but to Elena, it felt like a man trying to shed his own history. He was attempting to mask the scent of the old world with the perfumes of the new. Perhaps most telling were the glances. In the past, when they sat at the long table in the great hall, Alaric's eyes would often find hers. It was an expression of love, but one of confirmation, a silent check to ensure they were still aligned, still 2 parts of a whole. Now, his gaze seemed to slide over her like water over stone. He looked through her, his mind clearly occupied by a landscape she did not inhabit. When he did catch her eye, there was a flickering of something unsettled, not guilt, for Alaric was too proud for guilt, but a form of restless impatience. It was a look a man give a loyal old hound when he is considering a younger, faster pup. Elena observed these changes with the clinical detachment of a scholar. She did not seek out gossip, for she knew that the whispers of the court were often more reflection than reality. Instead, she watched the movements of the palace staff. She noticed which maidservants were being reassigned to the king's private library, a room he had rarely used in the past. She noted the arrival of a young woman, the daughter of a minor provincial lord, who had been brought to court under the guise of an internship in the royal archives. The girl was a flicker of bright color in the somber halls of Illyrius, all golden hair and effortless laughter, the very things that Elena, in her dutiful gravity, had never permitted herself to be. The atmosphere in their private quarters changed from a dignified silence to a heavy, pressurized stillness. During their evening meals, the king spoke more often of the future and the need for new perspectives, phrases that sounded rehearsed and hollow. He spoke of how the kingdom had become too stagnant, too beholden to the old ways of the north. Elena listened, her hand steady as she carved her meat, offering only the briefest of nods. She saw the trajectory he was on. He was building a narrative to justify a departure from the honor that had defined him. He was convincing himself that his restlessness was a political necessity rather than a personal weakness. There is a specific kind of pain that comes when a woman of Elena's stature realizes she is being moved like a piece on a board she herself designed. She had spent 30 years ensuring his legacy was untarnished, protecting him from his own impulses, and maintaining the dignity of the crown. To see him now, fumbling through the cliches of a midlife infatuation, felt like a desecration of their shared work. It was not merely a betrayal of a marriage bed. It was a betrayal of the institution of the monarchy itself. If the king could be so easily swayed by a pretty face and the scent of citrus, then the foundation of Illyrius was far more fragile than she had allowed herself to believe. She began to see the young girl everywhere, in the gardens and the galleries, always just on the periphery of the king's vision. The girl did not have Elena's intelligence nor her experience, but she possessed the one thing Elena could never reclaim, the illusion of a beginning. Alaric was a man who had reached the end of his achievements, and he was terrified of the silence that followed. He wanted to feel like a conqueror again, and this girl was a territory he could easily claim without the need for maps or armies. Elena did not cry. She did not confront him in a fit of passion. To do so would have been to admit that she was hurt, and in the game of power, vulnerability is the first step toward defeat. She remained the queen consort, the pillar of the north, the woman of iron and granite. But beneath the surface, the architecture of her loyalty was beginning to crumble. She was no longer looking at Alaric as her partner in the great work. She was looking at him as a liability, a man who had forgotten that the crown is a weight, not a toy. The signs were all there, undeniable and terminal. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a ghost haunting the halls of the keep, waiting for the light to hit it just right so it could finally be seen. There is a finality to the truth that suspicion lacks. Suspicion is a phantom, a flickering light in a dark room that allows the mind to retreat into the comfort of denial. But truth is a stone wall. It does not move, it does not bargain, and it offers no warmth. For months, Queen Elena had lived in the gray space of the unsaid, observing the king's retreat into his new, scented world. She had seen the signs, but she was a woman of evidence, a daughter of the North who understood that in a court of law and a court of kings, a conviction requires more than a feeling. She required the irrefutable. The discovery did not happen in a moment of passion or a midnight stakeout. It happened, as most significant things in her life did, in the quiet solitude of the royal archives. Elena was the keeper of the crown's inventory, a duty she performed with a reverence that bordered on the religious. Every coin, every tapestry, and every gemstone belonging to the house of Illyrius was recorded in the great ledger. These items were not merely wealth. They were the physical manifestation of the kingdom's history and the honor of the bloodline. It was during a routine audit of the royal treasury that she noticed a vacancy. It was a small item, easily overlooked by a less disciplined mind, a teardrop sapphire, known as the Eye of the North. It was not the most valuable stone in the collection, but its significance was immense. It had been a gift from Elena's own father to Alaric on the day of their wedding, a symbol of the alliance between their two houses. It was a stone of treaty, a piece of her heritage that was meant to be passed to their eventual heir, or held in trust for the stability of the realm. When she questioned the master of the wardrobe, a man who had served her for 20 years, he looked at his boots. He spoke of a repair requested by the king, a cleaning that required the stone to be sent to a jeweler in the lower city. But the ledger showed no receipt of its return, and the jeweler name was a man known for his discretion with the nobility's more private commissions, not for his work on royal regalia. A week later, the truth moved from the ledger to the light of day. It was the feast of the autumn equinox, a public celebration when nobility gathered in the great hall to mark the turning of the seasons. Elena sat in her accustomed place beside the king, her face a mask of regal indifference. She watched as a young woman, the girl from the archives, entered the room. The girl was dressed in a gown of pale cream, a color that signaled innocence and newness. And there, resting against the hollow of her throat, suspended by a delicate silver chain, was the Eye of the North. The sapphire caught the light of the torches, casting a cold blue glint across the room. It was an act of staggering arrogance. Alaric had not only betrayed their bed, he had stolen a symbol of her family's honor to adorn a girl who understood nothing of sacrifice or duty. He had taken a piece of the foundation and used it as a trinket. To Elena, this was the moment the ghost finally took on flesh. The betrayal was no longer a matter of wandering eyes or scent oils. It was a theft of history. She did not look at the king. She did not gasp, nor did she allow the wine in her glass to tremble. She looked at the girl, who wore the stone with a mixture of pride and ignorance, unaware that she was carrying a piece of a dying world around her neck. Elena realized then that Alaric believed himself to be above the very laws he had spent his life enforcing. He believed that his power was so absolute that he no longer needed to hide his transgressions from the woman who had helped him build that power. He viewed her not as a peer to be feared, but as an old piece of furniture that had become part of the background, present functional, but incapable of feeling or reaction. The banquet continued for hours. There were toasts of the harvest, music from the southern lutes, and the forced laughter of courtiers who had already noticed the jewel and were waiting to see if the queen would break. But Elena did not break. She spoke to the ambassadors with her usual clarity. She smiled at the appropriate moments, a thin, practiced movement of the lips that never reached her eyes. She was conducting a funeral in her heart, burying the last remnants of her respect for the man beside her. As the night wound down and the fires in the hearth began to dim, Alaric turned to her, his voice thick with the arrogance of wine and perceived victory. He made a comment about the refreshing energy of the evening, his eyes darting toward the girl who was now surrounded by a circle of ambitious young lords. Elena looked at him then, really looked at him, for the first time since the suspicion had begun. She saw the sagging skin beneath his chin, the hollow vanity in his gaze, and the profound weakness of a man who needed the adoration of a child to feel like a king. "It has been a revealing evening, Alaric," she said, her voice like a low-frequency bell, steady and resonant. "Revealing?" he asked, a brief shadow of uncertainty crossing his face. "The light in this hall is very clear," she replied. "It allows one to see the true value of things, and what has been lost in the shadows." He laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and stood to leave, confident that his secret was his own, or that, if known, it carried no consequence. He walked away, the scent of his southern oils trailing behind him, leaving Elena in the darkening hall. She sat there long after the servants began to clear the tables. The truth was now hers, heavy and cold. He had broken the vow of the North. He had desecrated the honor of their house. In the silence of the great hall, Elena understood that the time for being a shield was over. If the king wished to live in a world without the burden of honor, she would ensure he felt the full weight of that vacuum. The architecture of their life had been dismantled by his hand. She would now decide how the ruins would fall. The morning following the feast did not bring the clarity of a new day. Instead, it arrived with a gray, suffocating stillness that seemed to settle into the very pores of the stone walls. In the private soul of the queen consort, the hearth fire had long since died down to a pile of pale, exhausted ashes. Elena sat by the window, watching the mist rise from the river that bisected the capital. She did not require sleep. The mind of a woman who has spent 30 years calculating the risks of a kingdom does not easily surrender to the oblivion of rest when the foundations of her world have been cracked. She felt a profound, hollow weight in her chest, a sensation that was not quite sorrow, but something much older and more permanent. To those of a younger, more volatile disposition, the pain of a husband's wandering eye is a sharp, stinging thing, fueled by the heat of jealousy. But for Elena, at 55, the injury was far deeper than the ego. It was an existential insult. She looked at her hands, where the skin was beginning to thin over the knuckles, and she saw 30 years of labor. She saw the ink stains of 1,000 treaties, the calluses from riding to the northern borders in the dead of winter, and the invisible scars of every compromise she had made keep Alaric on his throne. She had traded her life for the stability of Valerius. She had left the wild, wind-swept freedom of the northern reach as a girl of 19, setting aside her own desires and the language of her people to become the perfect vessel for Alaric's ambitions. She had been the silent architect of his glory, the one who turned his crude military victories into a lasting civil peace. Every time he had been reckless, she had been cautious. Every time he had been cruel, she had been the one to quietly repair the damage to the crown's reputation. She had functioned as his conscience, his memory, and his anchor. The sight of the eye of the North around the throat of a girl who had done nothing but smile and exist was a declaration that this 30-year sacrifice was of no account. To Alaric, her loyalty was a commodity he had already consumed, a debt he felt he had already paid in full by allowing her to wear a crown. He did not see that the crown was not a gift he had given her, but a burden they were supposed to carry together. By giving away that sapphire, He had signaled to the entire court that the ancient alliances, the blood oaths of the North, and the dignity of the queen consort were all negotiable. He had made her a figure of pity. In the hallways of the palace that day, the silence was different. The servants moved with a frantic, exaggerated busyness, avoiding her gaze. The courtiers, those vultures who lived on the shifting winds of royal favor, bowed a little too low and held their smiles a little too long. She could feel their eyes on the back of her neck, measuring her. They were wondering when the queen would scream. They were waiting for the inevitable scene, the breaking of porcelain, the shouting behind closed doors, the public banishment of the girl. They expected the drama of a woman scorned. But Elena knew that to scream was to admit that he still had the power to hurt her. To react with emotion would be to descend to the level of the girl in the cream-colored dress. It would validate the king's narrative that she was the old, bitter relic of a bygone era, while he was a vibrant sun around which a new court would orbit. The humiliation she felt was a silent, cold thing. It was a realization that she was living in a house of her own design, but the locks had been changed while she was still inside. She thought of her father, the Duke of the Reach, a man who had taught her that honor was the only thing a soul takes into the afterlife. He had given that stone to Alaric as a gesture of absolute trust. If he were alive to see it now, he would not have called for tears. He would have called for a reckoning. The betrayal was not merely a breach of a marriage bed. It was a breach of the social contract that held the kingdom together. If the king could steal from his queen to satisfy a whim, then no lord's land was safe, and no merchant's contract was worth the paper it was written on. Alaric was not just betraying a wife. He was dismantling the moral authority of the monarchy. As the hours passed, Elena realized that the person she had been, the dutiful wife, the loyal shield, the silent partner, had died in the great hall the night before. The woman who remained was something different. She felt a strange, terrifying lightness. When one has lost their honor in the eyes of others, one is no longer bound by the rules that protect that honor. Alaric believed he had neutralized her by making her irrelevant. He believed that a woman of her age and station had nowhere to go and no weapons left to wield. He had forgotten that she was the one who managed the grain stores. He had forgotten that she was the one who held the keys to the diplomatic ciphers. He had forgotten that the provincial lords of the North did not swear fealty to a crown of gold, but to the blood of the woman who wore it. She stood up from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked to her mirror and looked at herself, not as a woman seeking beauty, but as a commander inspecting a garrison. She saw the iron in her own eyes, a cold fire that Alaric had never taken time to truly notice. He had mistaken her silence for submission for 30 years. He was about to learn that silence is also the sound of a trap being set. The humiliation would not be her end. It would be the fuel. She would not leave the palace, and she would not beg for his affection. She would remain exactly where she was, a ghost at his table and a shadow in his council, until the day he realized that in discarding her, he had discarded the only thing that kept the ground from opening up beneath his feet. The cost of her sacrifice had been her life. The cost of his betrayal would be his kingdom. There is a common misconception among the passionate and the young that revenge is a fire, a sudden, consuming heat that seeks to incinerate the offender in a moment of cathartic violence. But those who lived through the slow turning of decades, who have watched empires rise and seasons fade, know that true revenge is more like the sea. It is patient, it is cold, and it does not strike. It erodes. It finds the hairline fractures in the stone and, with the relentless weight of time, turns a fortress into sand. In the days following the revelation of the sapphire, Alaric braced himself for a storm. He had spent his life navigating the tempers of men and the furies of battle, and he expected his wife to follow the predictable path of the wounded. He expected the closed doors, the vitriolic accusations, or perhaps the dramatic departure back to the northern reach. He had even prepared his counter-arguments, framing her potential anger as the rationality of age or a failure to adapt to the new era. He was ready for a war of words, a conflict he felt he could win to the sheer weight of his sovereign authority. But the storm never came. Elena did not explode. She did not beg for the return of the stone, nor did she mention the girl who wore it. When they met for their morning briefings, she was as precise as a clock. She presented the grain reports, discussed a repair of the southern aqueducts, and reviewed the rosters for the winter guard. Her voice was the same level, melodic cadence it had always been. If anything, she was more efficient, more helpful, and more indispensable than ever before. Alaric, initially relieved, soon became unsettled. He found himself watching her from the corner of his eye, looking for a flicker of resentment that never appeared. He mistook her lack of reaction for a final, pathetic submission. He began to believe that he had truly broken her spirit, that she had accepted her displacement as a natural law. He relaxed. He spent more time in the gardens with his golden-haired distraction, leaving the heavy lifting of the state entirely in Elena's hands. He believed he was enjoying a second youth. In reality, he was handing her the keys to his exit. Elena's decision was not born of spite, but of a cold, tragic necessity. She looked at the man she had served and saw a king who had become a danger to his own kingdom. A ruler who betrays his primary oath is a ruler who has invited chaos into his house. If she left him, she would be abandoning Valerius to his increasingly erratic whims. If she stayed and fought him openly, she would tear the kingdom apart in a civil war of loyalties. There was only one path that preserved the honor of the North and the stability of the realm. She would remain the queen consort, but she would systematically strip the man of the power he no longer deserved to hold. She began with the logistics of loyalty. Power, she knew, is not held in a crown. It is held in the hands of the people who make the kingdom function. For 30 years, she had been the one who remembered the names of the captain's children, the one who ensured the provincial governors received their stipends on time, and the one who listened to the grievances of the merchant guilds. She began to subtly shift these relationships. When a governor arrived with a request for a tax holiday, it was Elena who granted it, making it clear that the king was occupied with other matters, but that she understood the necessity of the province's stability. She did not speak ill of Alaric. On the contrary, she protected him with a terrifying diligence. When he missed a council meeting to spend an afternoon hawking with a girl, Elena would apologize to the lords with a weary, knowing smile, the kind mother gives when speaking of a wayward child. She would then proceed to lead the meeting with such mastery and insight that the lords left the room feeling that the king was an ornament, while the queen was the engine. She was not stealing his power. She was simply catching it as he let it slip through his fingers. The revenge she chose was a form of silent, institutional isolation. She began to rewrite the social fabric of the court. Those who showed favor to the king's mistress found their requests delayed by bureaucracy. Those who remained loyal to the old ways, to the honor of the North and the dignity of the queen, found their paths smoothed and their influence expanded. She was creating a world where the king could walk anywhere he pleased, but where the ground beneath him was no longer his own. One evening, while Alaric was boasting of his new trade initiatives, ideas he had pilfered from Elena's own notes without realizing it, she looked at him and felt a profound sense of mourning. She was destroying the man she had once respected, but she was doing it to save the crown he was tarnishing. It was the most difficult work of her life. To take revenge through patience and intelligence requires a woman to bury her own heart in the process. She had to become the very thing she was accused of being, a cold, unfeeling administrator of a dying order. She understood that the end of this path would not be a victory she could celebrate. There would be no moment of triumph, no public shaming of the traitor. The consequences of betrayal would be a slow descent into irrelevance. He would remain king in name, surrounded by the gold and the perfumes and the pretty distractions he craved, but he would eventually wake up to find that his word carried no weight, his signature commanded no armies, and the woman who sat beside him was no longer his wife, but his jailer. Elena turned back to her ledgers, the scratching of her quill the only sound in the silent room. She was drafting a new set of appointments for the winter garrison. Men from her own lands, men who knew the value of an oath. The trap was not being built of iron. It was being woven of ink and influence. Alaric thought he was free, because he had discarded his honor. Elena knew that a man without honor is not free. He is merely adrift. And she was the only one left who knew how to guide the tide. Time in the great keep began to move with a strange, deceptive fluidity. To the outside world, the kingdom of Valerius was at its zenith. The banners flew high. The harvest was plentiful, and the king was often seen in the public squares, glowing with newfound, albeit superficial vitality. But within the stone ribs of the palace, A more profound transformation was taking place. Queen Elena was practicing the art of the silent regency, a method of rule where the person on the throne becomes a gilded figurehead, while the person in the shadows becomes the state itself. Her strategy was built on a singular, devastating insight. Alaric's greatest weakness was his newfound desire to be unburdened. He wanted the prestige of the crown without the weight of the scepter. He wanted the adoration of the young and the beauty of his new companion. But he had grown weary of the tedious, grinding work of governance. Elena decided to give him exactly what he wanted. She began to offer him the gift of indulgence. Whenever a complex legal dispute arose between the mountain clans, Elena would suggest that the king take a week for a hunting expedition in the southern forests, promising that she and the High Chancellor would prepare the preliminary drafts for his later review. When the merchant guilds complained about the new wharfage fees, she encouraged Alaric to delegate the negotiations to the young girl's brother, a man of high fashion and low intellect whom Alaric had recently knighted. She stopped being the voice of caution. She stopped being the friction that kept his impulses in check. It is a terrifying thing to realize that a person can be destroyed by being allowed to follow their own worst instincts. Alaric, feeling liberated from Elena's northern austerity, began to fill his inner circle with sycophants and the relatives of his mistress. These were men who told him what he wanted to hear, that he was the greatest strategist of the age, that the old laws were meant for lesser men, and that his legacy was unshakable. While they flattered him, Elena quietly documented their incompetence. She allowed them to overreach, to siphon small amounts in the treasury, and to offend the older, more powerful lords of the realm. She was giving them enough rope to hang not just themselves, but the king's reputation as well. The intelligence of her revenge lay in its invisibility. She was not a rebel. She was the ultimate loyalist. When the great lords of the West complained about the king's lack of attention to their border security, Elena met with them privately. She did not criticize the king. Instead, she sighed with a heavy, performative regret and explained that the king's new advisors were prioritizing different initiatives. She then, with a stroke of her own pen, authorized the funds for the West defense from her own personal estates, tying the loyalty of those lords directly to her person rather than the crown. She was weaving a net of patronage that bypassed the throne entirely. Alaric, meanwhile, was slowly being isolated by his own hand. He found himself surrounded by beauty and laughter, yet began to notice that the room grew quiet whenever he tried to discuss matters of actual substance. His new advisors had no answers for him, and the old advisors, the men of iron and granite who had built the kingdom with him, no longer sought his audience. They sought Elena's. They waited in the antechamber of her solar, reports in hand, bypassing the king's library as if it were a tomb. The consequences were beginning to manifest in the very fabric of the court's hierarchy. The new court of the king was a place of perfumes, poetry, and fleeting pleasures. It was a world of the present moment, where the sapphire around a girl's neck was more important than a trade treaty. But the real court, the one that managed the armies, the gold, and the law, remained firmly under Elena's control. She was creating a schism in the soul of Valerius. She allowed Alaric to believe he was the sun, while she ensured that the earth he shone upon was no longer his to command. One afternoon, Elena stood on the high ramparts, watching Alaric ride out with a troupe of musicians and his golden-haired distraction. He looked magnificent from a distance, the sun glinting off his polished breastplate. But she knew that beneath that armor, he was a man who no longer knew how much a bushel of wheat cost, or which of his generals were planning retirement, or how many of the northern clans were sharpening their axes in silence. He was a king who had traded his authority for an audience. She turned away from the battlements and returned to her desk. There were letters to be written to the Duke of the Reach, her brother. The tone of these letters was purely administrative, yet between the lines, the message was clear. The king had vacated his responsibilities. The honor of the North was being called upon to preserve the realm from the king's own neglect. By the time the winter snows began to fall, the transition would be complete. Alaric would still wear the crown, and he would still sit at the head of the table. But the kingdom would belong to the woman who had spent 30 years learning how to rule it in silence. The cost of this plan was a profound loneliness that settled over Elena like a second skin. To destroy the man she had once called partner required her to become a stranger to her own memories. She had to look at his failures not with the eyes of a wife who wanted him to be better, but with the eyes of a historian who knew he had already failed. She was methodically hollowing out the life they had built together, ensuring that when the end finally came, there would be nothing left for him to hold on to. It was a tragedy of her own making, a cold, calculated sacrifice of the past to secure a future he no longer deserved to inhabit. Isolation. For a man who has spent his life surrounded by the clamor of war and the bustle of a thriving court, does not arrive as a locked door. It arrives as a room full of people who are no longer listening. As the winter solstice approached, King Alaric found himself in the strange position of a man who possessed everything he had ever asked for, yet felt as though the very air in the palace was thinning. He had his youth, or at least the illusion of it, provided by the laughter and the adoring gaze of his young companion. He had his comfort, freed from the stern lectures and moral weight of the North. But he was beginning to realize that when you discard the people who tell you the truth, you are left with a silence that no amount of music can fill. The first time he felt the true chill of the position was during a meeting of the Council of Generals. In the past, these men, weathered, scarred veterans of his early campaigns, had looked at him with a fierce, unquestioning loyalty. They had argued with him, challenged his tactics, and ultimately followed him into the mouth of hell because they believed in the man behind the crown. But on this morning, as Alaric attempted to propose a new, flashy expansion of the southern border garrisons, he was met with a wall of polite, glass-eyed deference. The generals did not argue. They did not challenge him. They simply nodded, their faces as impassive as the stone busts in the hallway. When he finished speaking, the oldest of them, General Varick, turned his gaze not toward the king, but toward the queen, who sat at the end of the table, her hands folded neatly over a stack of logistics reports. There was a beat of silence, a heavy, pregnant pause that spoke volumes. Elena did not say a word to contradict the king. She merely offered a small, weary smile and remarked that the reallocation of the grain tax for such a project would require a careful review of the northern border's winter readiness. The generals immediately shifted their focus. The conversation moved to the practicalities of supply lines and fort maintenance, and within minutes, the king's grand proposal had been effectively shelved not by a veto, but by a quiet tide of administrative necessity. Alaric sat at the head of the table, his face flushed with a mounting, impotent frustration. He was the king. He had issued a directive. Yet, he felt like a child playing with wooden soldiers while the adults discussed the actual war. He realized, with a jolt of alarm, that these men no longer saw him as their commander. They saw him as a distraction to be managed. This pattern began to repeat in every corner of his life. He would enter a room, and the lively conversation would instantly transform into a stilted, formal display of etiquette. He would ask for a report from the Treasury, and he would be given a simplified summary, written in large, clear hand as if for a convalescent, while the detailed ledgers were carried directly to the Queen's Solar. He was being treated with the utmost respect. The kind of respect one gives to a fragile heirloom that is no longer used, but must be kept dusted for the sake of tradition. Even his relationship with the young girl, which had once felt like a revitalizing spring, began to take on the stagnant quality of a pond. She was beautiful, yes, and she spoke of poetry and the fashions of southern cities, but she had no understanding of the weight of the crown. When he tried to speak to her of his growing sense of displacement, of the way the lords looked at him, she would only giggle and tell him he was being too serious, or she would show him a new embroidery she had begun. She was a mirror that reflected only his own vanity, and as that vanity began to crumble under the pressure of his isolation, he found that he had nothing else to talk to her about. He was a man dying of thirst in a room full of sugar water. Elena, meanwhile, was the very picture of the devoted, selfless consort. She was always there, just a few paces behind him, ready with a piece of information he had forgotten or a name he could no longer recall. She was so helpful that it was suffocating. She never reminded him of his betrayal. She never spoke of the sapphire. She simply occupied the space he had vacated with such grace and efficiency that the world began to forget he had ever been the one in charge. The cruelty of her revenge lay in her perfection. By being the perfect queen, she highlighted his every failure as a king. The king began to suffer from a profound restlessness. He would wander the halls at night, looking for someone to speak to, someone who remembered the man he used to be. But the old guards were gone, replaced by younger men from the north who looked at him with a cold, professional distance. He would find himself standing outside the doors of Elena's solar, hearing the low, steady murmur of voices within, the voices of the men who actually ran the kingdom. He would reach for the handle, wanted to burst in and reclaim his place, but he would stop, paralyzed by the knowledge that he entered. The conversation would stop, the maps would be rolled up, and they would all wait with polite, empty smiles for him to leave again. He was beginning to understand that power is not a thing you own. It is a thing that is granted to you by the trust of others. And trust, once betrayed, does not simply vanish. It transfers. It had flowed away from him like water seeking lower ground, settling around Elena with a permanence that he could not contest without destroying the kingdom itself. He was being isolated not by walls of iron, but by the invisible, unbreakable bonds of the honor he had discarded. He was a traitor who was being punished by the very order he had sought to escape. In the dead of night, in the vast, cold expanse of the royal bedchamber, Alaric would lie awake, listening to the wind howling off the northern plains. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life. He had sought freedom from the ancient royal court and its dusty obligations, but had found only the terrifying freedom of a man lost at sea. He was alone, surrounded by people who bowed to his shadow, but ignored his soul. And the worst part, the part that kept him staring at the dark ceiling until the gray light of dawn, was that he knew exactly who had built this cage for him, and he knew she had done it with the very stones of loyalty he had thrown away. It is often observed by those who study the decline of great families that the final collapse is rarely preceded by a cataclysmic event. Instead, the end is signaled by the transformation of the familiar into the unrecognizable. The tragedy of King Alaric and Queen Elena was not found in a battlefield or a public execution, but in the ordinary details of their daily existence. The way the light fell across an empty chair, the sound of silver against porcelain in a quiet room, and the terrible weight of things left unsaid during a shared meal. By the late winter, the palace had become a place of profound, echoing stillness. Alaric found that his world had shrunk to a few rooms and a few repeating moments. The grand ceremonies and the boisterous laughter of his new court felt increasingly like a play being performed in a drafty theater. The real life of the kingdom happened elsewhere, and he was reminded of this every morning at the breakfast table. In the early years of their marriage, these morning meals had been a time of strategic planning. They would sit together in a small sun-drenched alcove, the steam from their tea rising in the cold morning air, and discuss the day's agenda. There had been a certain warmth in that shared purpose. Now, they sat in the same alcove, but the distance between them felt like a vast, uncrossable desert. Elena would sit across from him, her movements precise and graceful. She would butter her bread with a steady hand, her eyes focused on a ledger or a letter from the northern governors. She did not ignore him. That would have been a form of passion. Instead, she treated him with a polite, distant courtesy that was far more devastating. She would ask him if the tea was to his liking, or if he had slept well, her voice as smooth and cool as a river stone. She never looked up to meet his eyes. When he tried to initiate a conversation about the state of the realm, she would give him a brief, summary answer and then return to her work, as if she were a busy professional being interrupted by a well-meaning guest. Alaric would watch her hands, those strong, capable hands that had held the kingdom together, and he would realize that he no longer knew what she was thinking. He would look for a flicker of the woman he had known for 30 years, but he found only the queen. The silence between them was not the comfortable silence of old companions. It was a wall built of 3 decades of his own neglect and her final, absolute withdrawal. He would find himself staring at the empty seat at the table, where an heir should have sat, realizing that in his pursuit of a fleeting youth, he had extinguished the very future they were supposed to build. One afternoon, seeking to escape the oppressive quiet, the king visited his private library. In his younger days, this had been his sanctuary, a room filled with the scent of old leather and the maps of his conquests. But as he entered, he was struck by the layer of dust that had settled on the globes and the way the air felt stagnant and cold. A single, small detail caught his eye, a vase of flowers on his desk. They were lilies, his favorite, but they were wilted, their petals brown and curled at the edges. In the past, Elena would have ensured that the flowers were fresh, that the fire was lit, and that his favorite ink was replenished. These were the small, invisible ways she had nurtured his spirit for 30 years. To see the wilted lilies was to see the true state of his life. She had stopped tending to him. She was still providing for the king. The fires were lit in the public rooms. The palace was clean, and the guard were paid, but she had withdrawn the care she had once given to the man. He was a king in a well-managed museum, and he was the only exhibit that was allowed to decay. Even the shared rituals of the evening became a form of penance. They would walk together to the chapel for the evening prayers, their footsteps echoing in sync on the stone floor. To the guards and the priests, they looked like the very image of a stable, enduring monarchy. But Alaric could feel the coldness radiating from her like a physical force. He would catch a glimpse of her profile in the candlelight, the sharp line of her jaw, the silver in her hair that he had once ignored and now found beautiful in its dignity. He wanted to reach out and touch her hand, to beg for a word of genuine anger, something that would prove he still mattered to her. But he knew that if he touched her, she would not flinch. She would simply stop, look at him with those calm, analytical eyes, and ask him if he required assistance. She had mastered the geography of their silence so completely that he could find no way back to her. He was a prisoner of the ordinary. The scent of the sandalwood oil he had once used to please his mistress now felt cloying and desperate to him, a reminder of the foolish man he had become. The most painful detail was the sapphire. He still saw it occasionally, not on the girl, whom Elena had quietly and efficiently married off to a minor lord in a distant, rainy province, but in its velvet box on Elena's dressing table. She never wore it. She kept it there, an open wound in the light of day, a reminder of what he had stolen and what could never be returned. It sat there as a silent witness to the death of his honor. Alaric began to spend his days sitting by the window in his darkened library, watching the snow fall over the city he no longer ruled. He realized that the greatest consequence of his betrayal was not the loss of power, but the loss of home. He was a stranger in his own palace, living a life made of hollow habits and cold etiquette. He had traded a lifetime of loyalty for a moment of vanity, and the price was this: to be surrounded by the familiar and to find no comfort in it. He was a man drowning in the details of a life he had dismantled with his own hands, waiting for an end that felt like it had already arrived. History is often written by the victors, but the truth is kept by those who endure. As the long winter of King Alaric's reign finally began to yield to a pale, hesitant spring, the kingdom of Illyrius found itself at a crossroads. To the common people and the lesser nobility, the crown remained a symbol of unshakable strength. The laws were followed, the borders were secure, and the treasury was full. But to those who stood within the inner circle, the morality of the realm had shifted. It had become a kingdom held together by the cold iron of consequence rather than the warm breath of loyalty. The moral theme of this era was not one of loud judgments or public shaming. Elena knew that to openly condemn the king would be to invite the very instability she had spent her life preventing. Instead, she let the weight of his own actions serve as a sentence. She understood a fundamental truth that Alaric had ignored. Betrayal is not a singular event that occurs and then passes into memory. It is a poison that alters the chemistry of every relationship it touches. It is a debt that compounds itself, requiring payment in the currency of trust, which, once spent, cannot be remined from the earth. In the quiet of her study, Elena would often reflect on the nature of power. Alaric had believed that the crown granted him the right to be human, to be weak, and to be selfish. He believed that the high walls of the great keep protected him from the moral laws that governed the peasants in the fields. But Elena had lived long enough to know that the opposite is true. The higher the station, the more absolute the requirement for honor. A king who betrays his word does not just lose his wife. He loses a moral authority to demand truth from his subjects. He creates a world where every man is encouraged to look for his own advantage at the expense of his neighbor. She saw this erosion manifesting in the younger courtiers. They watched the king's indulgence and his subsequent isolation, and they learned the wrong lessons. They saw that the old virtues of the North, honesty, duty, and sacrifice, were being treated as relics. They began to practice the art of the half-truth and the calculated alliance. The spiritual rot was subtle, but it was there, a scent of decay beneath the blooming jasmine of the palace gardens. Elena fought this rot with the only weapon she had left, her own example. She remained a living embodiment of the old ways, a woman who had suffered the ultimate betrayal and responded not with bitterness, but with a terrifyingly pure dedication to the state. There was a profound tragedy in this moral victory. By becoming the perfect, unyielding symbol of honor, Elena had to sacrifice the last of her own humanity. She could not afford to be soft. She could not afford to forgive. Forgiveness, in this context, would have been a form of weakness that Alaric would have exploited to regain his superficial charms. To maintain the order of Valerius, she had to remain a statue of ice. She had to show the kingdom that betrayal always carries a price, and that the price is often the very thing the traitor hoped to gain. Alaric wanted freedom. He found a cage. He wanted youth. He found the hollowest form of aging. One evening, Alaric requested an audience with her, not a meeting of the council, but a private conversation. He looked at her across the expanse of her desk, his eyes searching for a crack in her armor. He spoke of reconciliation, of starting over, and of the unfortunate misunderstandings of the past year. He was trying to bargain with the truth, try and find a way to keep his crown and regain his comfort without having to face the wreckage he had caused. Elena listened to him with a patience that was more insulting than anger. When he finished, she did not remind him of the girl or the sapphire or the 30 years of her life he had discarded. She simply pointed to the window, where the lights of the city were beginning to flicker on. "The people out there do not sleep soundly because of your charisma, Alaric," she said, her voice a low, steady thrum. "They sleep because they believe the law is absolute. They believe that when a man swears an oath, it is a bond that cannot be broken. If I were to start over with you, I would be telling them that an oath is merely a suggestion. I would be telling them that honor has a price, and that is a price the kingdom of Valerius cannot afford to pay." He realized then that she was not punishing him out of spite. She was punishing him out of duty. She was a guardian of a moral order that he had abandoned, and she would not allow him back into the warmth of her trust because he was no longer the man who earned it. Power does not protect honor. It only makes the loss of it more visible. Alaric sat in the silence that followed, realizing that he had become a ghost in his own history. He had the gold, he had the titles, and he had the life he thought he wanted, but he had lost the only thing that made those things worth having: the right to look a good person in the eye without shame. The moral of the ruins was clear to anyone with the wisdom to see it. A kingdom is not built of stone and mortar, but the promises men and women make to one another in the dark. When those promises are broken, the stone remains, but the kingdom is gone. Elena would continue to rule in the shadows, and Alaric would continue to sit on his throne, but the truth between them was as final as a tombstone. The betrayal had carried its price, and it was being paid every day in the silent halls of the palace. There is a particular kind of silence that haunts the ruins of a life long after the inhabitants have ceased to struggle. It is not the silence of peace, but the silence of a house where the clocks have been left to run down, one by one, until the very concept of time feels like an antique. In the final years of the reign of Alaric and Elena, the great keep of Valerius became such a place. To the historians of the next century, this period would be known as a long stability, a time of unprecedented order and prosperity. But for those who lived within those walls, it was the era of the Great Hollow. King Alaric lived to be an old man, outlasting many of the generals who had once been his brothers in arms. He remained a figure of immense dignity to the public, a silver-haired monarch who appeared on the balcony during the high festivals, his crown gleaming as brightly as it had on the day of his coronation. He was surrounded by every luxury the world could provide: fine wines from the southern coast, silk tapestries that depicted his early victories, and a court of young, beautiful people who treated him with a reverence that bordered on the divine. Yet Alaric lived in a state of perpetual, quiet starvation. The awakening he had sought through his betrayal, the desire to feel young, to feel free, and to be unburdened by the way of the North, had turned into a desert. He had achieved the freedom of a man who is no longer needed. He would sit in his library for hours, the light of the setting sun creeping across the floor, waiting for a knock on the door that never came. He would hear the distant sounds of the palace, the hushed whispers of couriers, the sharp clatter of the queen's messengers, the rhythmic marching of the Northern Guard, and he knew that none of it required his permission. He had become a ghost in a machine of Elena's making. He understood now, in the late winter of his life, that the sapphire he had stolen was not just a stone. It was the key to the sanctuary of his own life. By treating Elena's honor as a trifle, he had taught her how to treat him as a phantom. He had wanted a life without the heavy, dusty traditions of his marriage. and she had given him exactly that. She had removed the burden of her expectations, and in doing so, she had removed the only thing that gave his presence meaning. Elena, too, grew old, but she did so with a terrifying, crystalline clarity. She did not retreat into the shadows. She became the shadows. She was the mind that animated the kingdom, the hand that moved the pieces on the board, and the voice that spoke through the mouths of 100 loyal administrators. She never remarried, and she never spoke of the king's infidelity. She simply became the institution itself. To look at her was to look at the law of the North, immovable, cold, and utterly indifferent to the pleas of the individual. In their final meeting, shortly before Alaric's strength finally failed him, he found her in the gallery of the ancestors. She was standing before a portrait of his father, her back to the door. He moved toward her, his breath coming in shallow, ragged intervals, and he spoke her name, not as a queen, but as the girl he had met on the windswept plains of the Reach so many years ago. He wanted, in that final hour, to ask for a sign that something of the old world remained. He wanted to know if the 30 years of their labor had been anything more than a blueprint for his own isolation. Elena did not turn around immediately. She stood in the silence of the gallery, her hands clasped in front of her. When she finally faced him, her expression was one of mild, professional concern. She asked him if the physicians had been to see him, or if the room was too cold. There was no hatred in her eyes, no lingering spark of the fire that had once burned between them. There was only a vast, polished emptiness. He saw then that she had not just taken his power, she had moved beyond the need for his existence. She had survived him long, before he was dead. The kingdom of Illyrius continued long after they were both gone, a testament to the stability Elena had engineered. The stories told of them were of a perfect union, a king and queen who had ruled with a singular mind and an iron will. The truth of the sapphire and the betrayal faded into the footnotes of history, dismissed as the gossip of a bored court. But the legacy they left behind was one of hollowed-out honor, a world where the laws were followed because they were efficient, not because they were right. Alaric died in his sleep, in the vast, cold bed where the silence had first begun. He died with the scent of sandalwood and citrus still lingering in the air, a final, mocking reminder of the choices he had made. Elena followed him a year later, leaving behind a kingdom that functioned like a perfect clockwork, and a throne that felt as cold as the northern ice. The story of the Great Keep is not a story of a kingdom that fell to an enemy at the gates. It is the story of a house that was dismantled from the inside, one broken promise at a time. It leaves us with the unsettling realization that the greatest tragedies are not found in the roar of battle, but in the quiet closing of a heart. We are left to wonder about the nature of our own vows and the hidden cost of the things we trade for a moment of perceived freedom. In the end, power is a poor substitute for the warmth of a shared history. If it were you, standing in those cold halls with the weight of 30 years of labor behind you, would you have chosen the path of silence, or would you have sought a different kind of ending? If you found this reflection on honor and the cost of betrayal meaningful, perhaps you would like to share your thoughts in the comments below. It is in these quiet discussions that we find the true measure of a life. Goodbye for now, and thank you for spending this time in the archives of Illyrius. If you wish to hear more stories from the long history of the kingdom, please consider subscribing so we may meet again in the next chapter. Until then, remember that the smallest betrayals often carry the heaviest prices, and that silence is the longest shadow of all.